In this video, I'm going to cover the Tufte reading for his principles for graphical design. I've already covered in another video his rules for graphical integrity. And again, please make sure if you haven't done the reading that you do the reading before you watch this video. So if you haven't done the reading, go ahead and hit pause now and go and complete the reading, because I'm only going to cover some of the points, not all of the points from the reading. So his principles for analytical design from the reading are these 6. I'm not going to read them all, but you should recognize these from the reading. And we're going to spend the most of our time on the first couple, because the other ones are, because they are the most important. The first couple are the most important. So the first one is comparison, right? And I've said this before, but compared to what is the fundamental question in analytics? Otherwise, we're just providing data. If we aren't using our data in a way that compares it to some other data, whether that's other data like last year's sales, or it's the budget versus the actual, or if it's against some sort of a goal, we're not really providing an analysis that allows decision makers to understand what happened. So no matter what the context, we are trying to help our viewers make intelligent and appropriate comparisons. Even in statistical tests, we test whether or not something is statistically significant because we compare it with some standard. So again, if you don't recognize these terms, lie factor, consistent scales, and standardization, go back to the other video on Tufte's rules for graphical integrity. So when we visualize data, we can lie. We can modify things to change the impact of the data. We can change what the effect in the data is by changing, well, we can not represent the actual data effect. We can change things so we overstate or understate the effect in the data. And that is the lie factor. And we learned before that consistent scales and standardization are 2 other rules that help us to reduce lie factor. When we're talking about helping our viewers to make comparisons, these are the 3 most important rules to make sure we are following. Lie factor, for the obvious reasons that we don't want to misrepresent the size of the effect in the data by changing the size of the effect in the graph. Consistent scales, because they create lie factor. And standardization, because without standardizing, we're really not comparing apples and apples in many cases. So if any of these graphical integrity rules are broken, the analytical design principle of being able to make comparisons is going to be reduced. This is the same graph that we looked at back with the lie factor, but just look at what we're asking the viewer to do. If we didn't calculate the lie factor for them at the bottom of this graph, and we just gave them the graph at the top, we would be very much overstating the difference between the fuel economy standard in 1978 and the fuel economy standard in 1985 by 14.8 times. So when we introduce large lie factor, we reduce the ability for the viewer to make comparisons, and again, compared to what is the most important thing we are trying to communicate. We see here how the simpler graph, just the line graph with some annotation, makes it much easier to make comparison between the number 18 and the number 27.5. In this bar chart, the ability to compare between the different subcategories on the left, those titles on the left, and to be able to compare them with each other as far as ranking, etc., is very difficult because we haven't sorted this graph. But we can make much better comparisons when we sort the graph or when we add additional decoration. For instance, these black lines representing last year's sales comparing to the blue bars, which are this year's sales. And when we add an additional layer of color, where we see which bars are exceeding last year's sales, which bars are not, we give the user many different choices of comparison they can make. They can compare each bar against its performance against last year. They can compare each bar against all the other bars for the ranking. And they can compare each bar against their performance from last year, and they can see how which bar would have been in one rank last year and is in a different rank this year. So comparison is the most common kind of representation that we're going to be doing in most of our graphs. The second most common is trying to show causality or cause. Now, we can't prove causality with a picture, but we can certainly illustrate causality with a picture in a way that is both either good or not so good, all right? So in order to show causality, we have to provide evidence and contextual cues that help us communicate the fact that before the assumed cause happened, the world was one way, and after the cause happened, the world is another way. All right, so we've looked at this graph in a previous reading where we had these diverging salaries between doctors and other professionals. And then we compared that graph with this graph where we actually show that the slope of the line of the doctors, which is the top line, is different before and after 1962. We provide this annotation in this graph, Medicare began, which provides a reasonable hypothesis as to why the slopes diverged at that particular point. Either doctors were able to see more patients because more patients could afford to be seen, or the government was inefficient and it's paying more money than it should. Whichever, whether you're pessimistic or optimistic, it doesn't matter. The cause seems to be clear that when Medicare was introduced, slopes that were diverging at a relatively consistent pace sped up their divergence afterwards. Now this is a great graph. It's hard to see in the video here, but look real close at it and look at the slides that are online. This is a wonderful graph that helps to illustrate patterns of immigration to the United States. And we see that immigration peaked around 1910 with about 8.8 million and then sank until World War II, until after World War II. And it didn't reach the same level until about the year 2000. But this graph tells us a lot more than just the number of people who immigrated. It tells us the proportion of the people who immigrated by continent, and then it provides all of these different annotations that try to help us understand the why of the what. So the what is immigration patterns changed, and these annotations help us to try to provide the viewer with some context as to why these things changed. So for instance, in the 1960s, before the 1960s, there was a quota system for entry into the United States, which favored the current makeup of the United States. So if 80% of the people of the United States were of European origin, the quota system said 80% of new migrants had to be from that region. In the 60s, that was reversed. It was actually inverted. So if 80% of the population was whatever, it could only have 20% after this. All right? And you can see that there's direct results of that change, and that's all illustrated here on this chart. This chart won some awards, but it's got a lot of annotation, and you might be able to do slightly better when you're doing it not on a printed page, but maybe with a computer you could show just different categories, because the annotations are in different colors, which kind of shows the different categories of what they are, etc. But this is basically trying to show us the why of the what, or the cause of the slope changing. And remember, the only interesting part of a line graph is when the line bends. Show me that the line bends, and then show me why it bent. Now, again, causality is very rarely a one variable answer, right? It's very rare that something is caused by only one other thing. And so evidence is not two-dimensional, and we should show multivariate data whenever we can. And by multivariate data, we're talking about not simply the sales, but the sales and the profit and the number of salespeople. All of these things play into the cause of our profitability. The sales, the number of salespeople, the regions that we're in, the number of locations we have. All of these things are things that we have to either standardize by or show so that we understand really what's going on. The next principle that Tufte argues is that we must integrate the evidence. And by that he means what we just saw in the previous graph with all of the different annotations. Use as much as you need to show the evidence in your graph. One thing that wasn't in the reading, but I really need to stress at this point, is that we can never assume that we know what the user knows, that the users know what we know, and we can never assume that we know all the users. We might be able to control who the visualization is distributed to first, but we can never control who else might see it. And for that reason, we want to be able to create visualizations that we don't have to be there to explain, right? So the goal of our visualization is to make sure that we've made the visualization not wrong or intuitive enough that the user can make inferences without our assistance. We don't want to create visualizations like they do for TED Talks, where we have to stand there and explain the whole thing. We want to be able to provide annotation and narrative so that they can understand the story of the data without assistance. And that's one reason that this graph is excellent, in that it does those things. I can read through this without the graph maker being here and make decisions about whether I think that those causes are legitimate or are realistic for what changed the slope of the lines. And finally, Tufte argues that you must document your visualizations. Now, he says every visualization should have all of this documentation information on it. Now, the reality is that, remember, he was writing these books in the era of paper visualizations and not computerized visualizations. So we're going to thoroughly describe where we get the evidence from or where we get our data from. But for instance, if you're distributing a Tableau workbook, you don't need to put that on every page, but you should put it somewhere in the workbook so that people can see it. And documentation is, what's the display about? And we've already seen that sometimes titles aren't necessarily accurate. So we have to make sure that our titles are accurate. Who did the work, especially for publicly posted visualizations, and who is that person? What organization are they with? So if you see a gun control image, and if you see a visualization about the effects of gun control, and it's from the National Rifle Association, you will interpret that graph differently than if it came from the Brady Bill people who are against gun rights. All right. So we have to have when was the work done. So when was it published? If possible, where it was published, where are the data sources, even to the point that if somebody wanted to go find the data and do what you've done, how could they do that if it's publicly available data? What are your assumptions? This is always a really hard one. And Tufte just says, oh yeah, just include your assumptions. But the reality is that it's often very difficult to really recognize our assumptions. But try when you need to illustrate them. And you'll illustrate your assumptions by doing things like standardizing data in certain ways. So if you're going to talk about comparative military budgets, are you going to standardize that by population, or are you going to standardize that by gross domestic product? Your choice on that might illustrate to you what your assumptions are. And then finally, who published the work? Is it coming from Reuters, or is it coming from Joe's blog? The publisher adds a certain amount of credibility to it when we're talking about publicly accessible graphs. But most importantly, content is king in any of our visualizations. Artistic considerations should always be secondary to truthfully presenting the content. So if you don't remember this, go to the Meta Rules video. or go to the other Tufte video and just review the importance of delivering visual content with integrity, because we have so much power as data visualizers that we can easily mislead in a way that people aren't conscious of. When we try to mislead with words, people can consciously evaluate those words. Because so much of visualization and so much of visual perception is pre-conscious or unconscious, sometimes people have a very hard time identifying when they need to be critical or more critical of a graph. So truthfully present your content at the expense of making it pretty or cool looking.